Okay, make sure we're recording. So tonight we're going to talk about Midrash. I am a self-professed Midrash junkie. I love Midrash. Here comes Hannah. Perfect timing, she missed the joke. I just think Midrash is delightful and enjoyable and clever and sometimes touching, and I think you'll get a taste for why we get here. Perfect timing, Hannah. No mezuzah, sorry. She's looking for a mezuzah on the door. Because you missed the joke, see, you didn't have to. Yeah, it's the one you didn't want to hear it again, so you did perfect timing. Yeah, look at her happy. Okay, so tonight we're talking about Midrash, which is really a uniquely Jewish way of approaching Scripture. The underlying premise of Midrash is that Scripture has infinite layers of meaning. There's always the simple, straightforward meaning of a text. This is called the Peshat. But then there are these layers of hidden meaning, which they use the word drash, which means to seek out, to find. And this is where the word midrash comes from. It's something that's been sought out. The difference is people who are looking at text from a grammatical, historical perspective are asking the question, what was the author thinking of when he wrote the text? Whereas Midrash says, I don't care what the author was thinking, what was God thinking when he had the guy write the text? And so the assumption here is that the author may not have been aware of these many different interpretations or understandings of it, that he just wrote what he wrote, probably wrote the Peshat, the straightforward meaning, but then God imbued the text with all these different meanings. So Midrash is looking at what God is saying or thinking. Uh-oh, there it goes. From the perspective of God in eternity, the Scriptures are really a timeless unity, is what the rabbis say, in which each and every verse is simultaneously with every other verse, both temporally and semantically. So, as we will see tonight, they will take texts from Genesis and texts from Daniel or Jeremiah or something and push them together, and you go, wait, what the heck are they doing? How can this be? But from this midrashic point of view, God is timeless. He sets above the text. He knows that Jeremiah was going to write what he wrote hundreds of years later, and he's imbuing this with this hidden meaning. And semantically the idea is that when we find similar terms or phrases, that this isn't by accident. This is God giving us a hint that there's some connection here that we can explore and seek out and get the meaning out of it.
Christians do this too. Isn't this done in the church all the time?
I think it is, just not quite the same way. I think Christians do typology a lot, which is certainly one aspect of Midrash, but I don't. Yeah, to some extent, I think that's true. Midrash assumes, did I miss a slide? Yeah, if every word of the Old Testament is truly the utterance of God, then a given statement in one Old Testament book would need to be considered not only within its own documentary context, but also in light of the broader context of the canon as a whole. Midrash assumes divine inspiration of Scripture and inerrancy of Scripture to the max. So a scribal error is not a scribal error. God meant for that letter to be written funny or to be missing or whatever the case may be, that there's hidden meaning in that when you find that. So sometimes people look at Midrash and they say, well, you're just finding your own meanings in the text. And, how can you be doing this? But really, from the Midrashic mindset, it's not that I'm imbuing it with my own thoughts or whatever, but again, I'm finding the mind of God behind the text. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily buy all the conclusions that come out of Midrash, but again, I can find it inspiring, even if I don't necessarily believe that God really intended for it to say what the Midrash is saying it said. Does that make sense? So Midrash seeks to explain inconsistencies in the text or in the story or with something of that nature, to fill in gaps or explain why something was happening. We're going to see an example of this. Eliminate superfluous text. So the rabbis hate superfluous text, and the Bible is full of it, right? So if it says Abraham went to the store Abraham went, right? This is superfluous. And there must be meaning behind that. It's not just the style of the writing. Somebody that's doing like literary analysis would just say, well, this is being written alliteratively or whatever. But the rabbis say, no, it can't have superfluousness, and therefore there must be, more to it than that. A quick example of that's not in my notes, but for example, we have do not steal as one of the 10 commandments, right? But there's a later commandment, I forget where it's at, but later on in one of the other books of the Bible, is either in Deuteronomy or Numbers or somewhere, it says, it talks about you will not be a thief, right? And so the rabbis say this can't be the same commandment twice. I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is halakhic midrash. This is deriving a law based on the midrashic analysis. So they say this can't be that he would give us the commandment twice. And therefore the conclusion is that in the 10 commandments, when it says do not steal, it's actually talking about kidnapping, stealing a person. And the other one is talking about stealing property. And the reason for this is that it's right next to do not commit murder and do not commit adultery, both of which are capital crimes, right? And so this do not steal must be a capital crime because it's associated closely with these other commandments. And we have this later commandment that would be superfluous if they both meant to literally steal property. Does that make sense? So there's an example of, it's actually a better example than the one I came up with for tonight. It just came to me. Pardon me?
Are there alternatives?
Oh yeah, of course.
Because I can think of one.
Oh yeah, there's many. Anyway, and then like I said, dealing with scribal errors as well. It's interesting when in the Talmud, you will see the rabbis doing some level of critical text analysis in the Talmud, and they'll say, oh, this was just a scribal error, and they'll wipe the issue away with that. But when it comes to the Torah, no, that's sacrosanct. This is the divine text, and it can't be that there's a scribal error in there. So you're seeing that level of devotion to the text. The Talmud is viewed as less than Scripture in that way. Not only is the text defined according to the rabbis, but the process of interpretation is divine as well. So God is in me, helping me see these connections in the text. So, what are the types of midrash? Well, there's two basic types of midrash. There's halakhic midrash that I just gave you an example for. This is midrash that derives laws from it. So here you have the case that I just gave you where the 10 Commandments, do not steal, is being interpreted as a mitzvah to not kidnap, and then the later one is the mitzvah to not steal property. Another example of this is, and let me back up for a second and say, midrash, to be midrash, always has to be working off of a text, right? You can't just come up with this stuff out of the air. So another example of this is that in the Torah it says you will not work on the Sabbath, but it doesn't say what work is, right? And so the rabbis say, well, we have to know what is forbidden to do on the Sabbath. And what they concluded was that any kind of labor that was associated with building the tabernacle is the kind of labor that's forbidden. And they actually come up with 39 categories of labor. Sewing, making a fire, cutting, these sorts of things that went into building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Now, why do you think that would be? Why would they make that connection at all in there? Any thoughts? What would be the connection? Pardon me?
Because they connected it with creation.
Well, they did sort of in a backwards way. We'll get to that in a second. But the more obvious connection is that, again, the text for building of the Mishkan comes exactly after a long passage about these are the Sabbath laws and you shall not work on them. And so they say because these are in proximity, I don't have these texts for you, but there's texts where they say there's no reason for the commandments about Sabbath to be right next to the commandments. In some cases it might even be that the text that they're looking at is oddly situated. Right? It's like, why is that suddenly there? And so they look at those things and they say, oh, well, these were intentionally put together, and this is why God had the authors do it so that they could make this connection between the two. But then what happens that comes out of that is now that you have this connection kind of based on proximity, right? Then they start saying, well, why would the building of the Mishkan, other than work, be something, prohibited on the Sabbath? And then what ends up devolving is kind of like midrash upon midrash, where they take that and they say, well, God created the world, right? And he put mankind into it. Sorry, humanity. I'm trying to expunge the word mankind out of my vocabulary. He put humanity into it. And humanity's purpose, based on another midrash, is to create a home for God in the world. And the Mishkan represents that very, essence of that goal, right? That God comes and dwells in the midst of Israel. And therefore, it is connected to creation in that sort of a way. Does that make sense? Did I say that clearly? Again, brain's a little short-circuiting here. Now, why 39 types of work? Because if you go and you look at the text about the building of the Mishkan, you don't come up with 39. It's not there. And what's kind of interesting about this is that, this is a complete aside, but the number 40 means completeness in the Bible, right? And, like they were in the wilderness 40 years and, these sorts of things. But because of that, if you give somebody lashes, you give them 40 minus 1, right? The Torah says to give 40, they give 1 less to show that we should be merciful, right? So what the rabbi said is the reason why there's 39 is because if we gave you 40 prohibitions for this not to do on the Sabbath, then the Sabbath would become this horribly onerous thing that you can't do anything on the Sabbath, which is kind of still true at 39, but anyway, beside the point. And so we make the number 39. It's one less because God also wants us to enjoy the Sabbath and make it a delight. And so you see these sort of, pardon me?
I'm sorry, this reminds me of what Jesus said. The Sabbath was made for man, not made for the Sabbath.
Yes, exactly. The rabbis are reflecting that idea with this 39. If it was 40, then man would be made for the Sabbath. That's a good connection there to take with it. Yeah. So, and that's this is a really, so the problem is people look at what the rabbis say on the surface, and it can look very legalistic. It can look like the law is driving humanity. But when you really dig into it, you find out, no, the rabbis are looking at this from the opposite angle. It just seems that way on the surface, but when you really dig into it, you see different. And then Agadic Midrash, I put the word legal there. I'm sorry, that's wrong. That's the one above it. Halakhic Midrash is legal. Agadic Midrash is homiletical. Agada just means story. And so these are quite often, they're like sermons that rabbis gave and they were preserved, where they would do this sort of midrashic exegesis of the text and use it in their sermons and that sort of a thing. And Agadic Midrash is really meant to teach a lesson or to inspire rather than to say this is the law. That makes sense. Now, there's also Agada. Agada just means a story, and not all Agada is Agadic Midrash, right? It could just be a story, and again, the deciding factor is whether it's tied to a piece of scripture or not. So, for example, we have this story, this Agada, of Abraham as a young boy. The rabbis are trying to understand why Abraham became a monotheist. Why was he the one that recognized God, heard God, and responded to that? And so they tell this story. So this is like a legend. It's not connected to scripture in any way. Where as a young boy, his father was an idol seller. He made and sold idols. And one day his father goes out of town. You guys heard this story before?
No.
It's a pretty well-known story. I might have shared it before. Anyway, his father goes out of town for the day, and Abraham, being the budding young monotheist, takes an axe and smashes all the idols in the store, except the biggest one, and he puts the axe in the idol's hands. And his father comes home at the end of the day, and he goes, Abraham, what have you done here, to my store, to my merchandise? And he says, well, Father, I didn't do this. The idol did it. He's holding the weapon right there. And he goes, don't be silly. The idol can't move. It can't do anything like this. And he says, well, then, Father, why do you worship them? And so it's just kind of this, clever little legend that's trying to explain why would Abraham, be the one who responded to God's call. He already had it in him, even as a young boy. But it's not Midrash.
That's an interesting story. Isn't there some indication from the scriptures that perhaps Terah received the call from God before Abraham did? I mean, he did move to Haran, where Abraham's brother died in Haran, and Terah seemed to stay there, and then Abraham went on. I wonder if Terah didn't receive the call in some sense before God. I mean, that would almost sound like, that would be a neat story. After Abraham says this to his father, he thinks about it, he says, you know what, you're right.
Yeah, I've heard that theory before, but I don't know where the source of it was. There could be a midrash on that says, Terah did respond, but then he didn't respond enough.
That's right. He wasn't
or something. Yeah, I wouldn't put it past the rabbis, believe me. They can come up with anything. The Midrashim were written down roughly between 200 to 1200 of this common era. But many of these were orally passed on and were later written down. So, as we'll see, there were some midrashic treatments, or maybe what you'd call proto-midrash, in New Testament times, that the authors were certainly working off of that and thinking that way, even though really the heyday of midrashic exegesis is a couple centuries later. It's pretty certain that it was. And there's all kinds of collections of midrashim. The big one is called Midrash Rabbah. This is almost all Aggadic Midrash. It's actually just a collection of, there's a Midrash Genesis, there's a Midrash Exodus. It's the first 5 books, and it's just all been compiled into one giant book. There's what's referred to as the Mekilta, which is another midrashic text. The Sifrei is a halakhic midrash text. There's a Sifrei to the Book of Numbers. There's a Sifrei Deuteronomy, I believe. Is that right, Hannah? If you just go out to Wikipedia and search on Midrash, it'll show you all the major texts for it. I didn't put them all in here, but certainly the most famous is Midrash Rabbah. Rabbah just means great. This is like the great Midrash, because it's all the Midrash on the first 5 books of Moses put into one place. So, to explain Midrash, I'm going to give you a Midrash. This is our first text that we'll look at. So you'll notice here that this is a Torah scroll, and see these little tagim is what they're called, little like decorations, crowns at the tops of those letters up there. You can see it okay? These are decorations that are put on the letters themselves, and this comes important in this midrash. By the way, when Yeshua talked about not one jot or tittle of the law will pass, he's actually referring to these decorations on the letters, these insignificant things that are just there. No, they're not vowel markings. They're literally just decorations. So our first text here, Moses and Akiva, is from the Talmud. The tractate Menachot says, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Rav was he's one of the top dogs. He's one of the early, very prominent rabbis of that day, 1,000 years before Rashi, believe it or not. And so he's saying, when it says in the name of, that means he got this teaching from Rav. He was probably a student of his. When Moses went up on high, he found the Holy One setting and tying crowns on the holy letters. That's this things that I'm showing up there on the screen. He said to the Holy One, ruler of the universe, who is holding back your hand? The Holy One answered, there is a man who will appear at the end of several generations, named Akiva, the son of Joseph, is his name, and he will need these crowns, because from each and every thorn, so that's actually what it is referring to as little thorns or daggers, he will derive scores and scores of laws. And he said to him, ruler of the universe, show this man to me. And the Holy One said, turn around. So Moses went and sat at the back of Rabbi Akiva's class and had no idea what they were saying. He became weak and disoriented. Soon the class reached an issue, and a student asked, Rebbe, what is your source for this ruling? He's talking to Akiva here, and he says, it's a law of Moses from Sinai. And Moses was relieved. So this is a little midrash given in the Talmud where they're expressing this idea that there's layers and layers of meaning. So here, Moses, who is the one who gives the Torah, doesn't even understand everything that he's giving. This is exactly the Midrashic point of view. And God whisked him forward into history. Akiva lived during the 1st century, and he was actually killed by the Romans. He was caught up in the whole Bar Kokhba rebellion, and he's the one that said Bar Kokhba was the Messiah and all that. And he ends up being killed. But he's a very, Akiva is, again, this very early rabbi that's very prominent, lots of teachings from him. And so Moses is in the back of his class and he can't understand what he's saying. But yet he's the one that gave the Torah. And then God tells him, well, he's the one who could discern the hidden meanings behind this. Did you have a question, Anna?
Oh, 2 things.
Uh-huh.
One is I just wanted to point out that this was the story I was referencing in my talk last month.
Uh-huh.
Sounds familiar?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, someone asked me a question about do rabbis view their laws, oral law, as coming at Sinai or as at a secondary level? And I said there were both opinions, and this represents the idea that it evolves later because Moses was at Sinai and didn't understand it. Also, how are you classifying this as a Midrash? There's no Bible verse that they're responding to, is there?
Well, it's, don't ask questions like that. It's based off the text itself. There you go.
There you go. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is referred to as Midrash. Yeah. So, the interesting thing too is that these crowns were added, thousands of years after Moses. But again, the rabbis conflate time and just pull all this stuff together. So Moses wouldn't have necessarily seen crowns on letters. Matter of fact, it's not even the right alphabet. The Bible was originally written in Paleo-Hebrew. This is Aramaic script that came out of the exile in Babylon. So it's not even the same alphabet. If you look at Paleo-Hebrew, it looks like Phoenician, not like this at all.
So you're saying this arose between 5 and 600 BC?
The letters, yes. I'm not sure exactly when the Tagim came into play, but because it's this early in the Talmud, it's probably pretty early. So these decorations were certainly added by the 1st century, maybe even sooner than that. But yes, this alphabet came out of the exile. Prior to that, if you ever read biblical archaeology or anything, there was an article just a few weeks ago where they found an inscription that referred to a person that's mentioned in the Bible or something. But then if you look at the picture, it doesn't look like this at all. It looks like they look like pictograms almost. And it's early enough that it doesn't have, if it's from the time of like King David, it's not written with this script at all. It's Paleo-Hebrew. Yeah.
One little question about these crowns or decorations. Are they consistent? I mean, in other words, if you would see a copy of the scriptures with this on, see another copy of the scriptures with the letters, with the decorations above each letter being basically consistent.
They got standardized in the Middle Ages. But prior to that, it was more, as with everything, the prayer book was not standardized until really you got to printing presses, and the same kind of thing. So it did get standardized later in time. Kind of like Scottish kilts. Everybody says, "Oh, this is the MacDonald clan kilt," But actually, in the days when that was like a deal, they wore just whatever. But then it was later that it got established. This is the pattern for this clan, and this is the pattern for that clan. It's a very totally random piece of information. Let's see. Okay, so let's look at another one. This one is one of my favorites. So That's the next text here. It says, in 5 places, Yaakov, that's Jacob, is written in full form with a vav, and Eliyahu, which is Elijah, is written in lacking form without a vav in 5 places. So 5 places Jacob has an extra vav, and in 5 places in the Torah you have Elijah is missing a vav. Okay, this little letter, we'll show it to you in a second. Yaakov took a letter from Eliyahu's name as a guarantee that he will come and announce the redemption of his people.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
It's just so fun.
It's a great story.
It's just a great story. But again, the rabbis look at this, and well, let me just show you. So here we have, this is the normal way that Jacob is written, Yaakov, and you'll notice that there's only 4 letters here. The Yud, Ayin, Kof, and a Beit. But in 5 places in the Torah, it's written Yaakov with a Vav in there. It sounds exactly the same. You know, it's both a dot at the top is an O sound, and so is a Vav with a dot on top of it. Both are O sounds. And these are your vowels you were looking for. Actually, that dot's a vowel, and then these down here are vowels. Okay, then we have Eliyahu with the vav at the end. A vav with a dot in the middle is an U sound instead of an O sound. But in 5 places of the Torah, it just says Eliyah. The U is missing. Now, we would look at that and say, this is a scribal error or something, you know, this is no big deal. Yeah, you know, or maybe there was an alternative spelling of it back then, but not to the Midrashic mind. The Midrashic mind says, 5 Yaakovs and 5 Elijahs, there's got to be something here. And so they say, Jacob stole these 5 from Elijah as like collateral, so that Elijah would come and announce the Messiah and make sure. And then they ask, why, where did I write my notes down at? I don't know where I put them. Then they ask, why 5? Right? And it says, because there's 5 fingers on a hand, and he and Jacob made an agreement. They shook hands that Elijah would indeed honor his commitment and get his vavs back at the end of time. As you see this sort of a thing. And then they say, why was it Jacob who did this? Why couldn't it have been Abraham or Isaac? As a matter of fact, you could put a vav in Abraham and Isaac's name and not change the pronunciation either. So why is it Jacob? And they said, well, because Jacob is the one who experienced exile the most. Because he's the one that actually went down and ended up dying in Egypt. And so he's mostly concerned about his descendants being in exile. And so he's the one that does this to get Elijah to do it. Isn't that just fun?
Jacob stuck a lot of deals like this. I mean, he tricked Esau, he tricked...
Yeah, actually it says that, yeah.
To do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, actually it says that. He goes, he is the heel grabber, and so he's the one that grabs these vavs from Elijah. And it's really
What's
clever.
really cool about this story, once you hear this story, you'll never forget that Elijah's coming back.
Yeah,
You'll
exactly.
never forget that.
Yeah.
You know, this you'll never forget.
And if you come across the text where it's got a vav missing, you'll go, you know, there it is. There's 5 of them. I went and found them. I didn't write down the references, but they're there. Okay, so that's a case where the Midrash is trying to deal with what's most likely a textual error or something of that nature. The next one I want to look at is an example where something's missing. And this is the story of Cain and Abel. So our text here, and I just put the text from Genesis here. It says, and Cain talked to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel and his brother and slew him. What's missing here? There's something missing. Exactly. It just says he talked to Abel, his brother. What did he say? You know, what was going on? And so we get in Genesis Rabbah this opinions about it. I think there's 3. I don't know if I gave you 2 or 3. First one says, about what did they quarrel? Come, they said, let's divide the world. Okay, one took the land and the other one took all the movables, the portable property. So it was real estate and everything else. The former said, the land you're standing on is mine. While the latter retorted, what you're wearing is mine. The one says, strip, take off your clothes. The other one retorts, fly, get off my land. And then they had the big fight. So here what they're building off of is Cain, the farmer, takes the land, and Abel, the shepherd, takes all the movable property. That's why they're coming up with this notion. And then they say, this is what the argument was about. They were already contentious with one another. It wasn't just the sacrifice not being accepted by God. These were your typical feuding brothers. And they have this argument. And then they go from there. The next one says, Rabbi Joshua of Sichnan said in Rabbi Levi's name, both took land and both too took movables. So what about did they quarrel? One said, the temple must be built in my area, while the other one claimed it must be built in mine. For it is written, and it came to pass when they were in the field. Now field refers to naught but the temple. As you read, Zion shall be plowed as a field. And they're quoting Micah 3 here. So now you're seeing several things happening, right? First of all, you're seeing this conflation of time. Somehow Cain and Abel have magically learned that someday a temple will be built. And they each want it to be on their property. And they're arguing about it. And secondly, is they're taking this notion of them being in the field where the battle happens, and they're seeing that that Zion gets referred to as a field in the book of Micah, and they say, oh, this is not by accident, this is significant, and they pull the 2 texts together and say, the field is referring to this argument about the temple. Again, rather clever, I think. Again, like I said, even if I don't buy it, I just think it's delightful. I think it's enjoyable to look at these things. Yes?
Yeah, the taking the definition from field in one place and imposing it upon another location is actually a Midrash. It's called Zerah Shabbat.
Correct. Yeah, where you're finding these connections to each other.
Yeah, it's like it was used so often that the rabbis have like a name.
Yeah, there's actually a whole bunch of these names I didn't want to get into, but there's maybe about, I don't know how many, there's 13 or 20 of these different techniques. And one of them is this, that you find these 2 common words and you bring them together.
It strikes me that there is a reference in the Gospel of Matthew where it says Jesus, Mary and Joseph went back and they settled in Nazareth, and therefore he was, and then it refers to this passage, which who knows where it is exactly. It says he will be called a Nazarene.
Well,
Now-
we'll get there.
Now that almost sounds like Midrash to me.
We'll get there. You're jumping ahead of me. Yep. Yep, exactly. This is exactly what you're going to see. Okay. There is a third one I didn't put in here where they were arguing over a woman. And, that was the reason that was given.
That's probably the right one.
That's probably the right one, yeah. So the second one here, I dubbed the 2 mems. Now the letter M in Aramaic script and in Hebrew, modern Hebrew script, has 2 forms. There's what's called an open form, because you got a little opening here at the bottom, and then there's a closed form. The open form occurs in words that are the beginning of syllables. If the mem is at the beginning of a syllable, then it's open. If it's at the end of a syllable or the end of a word, by definition it's the end of a syllable, it's always closed. But there's a couple places in the Torah where they're reversed. And this can't be just by accident. And so we're going to look at this. So the first passage is Isaiah 9, for a child is born to us, a son is given to us. Now this is a passage you guys are very familiar with, right? Now you're going to find a hidden gem in here. It's going to be cool. It says, dominion will rest on his shoulders, and he will be given the name Pele Yoetz, El Gabor, Aviad, Sar Shalom, which means wonderful counselor, mighty God, Father of eternity, and Prince of peace, in order to extend the dominion and perpetuate the peace of the throne and kingdom of David, to secure it and sustain it through justice and righteousness, henceforth and forever. The zeal of Adonai Tzivaot, this is the Lord of hosts, will accomplish this. Now I boldened the to extend, because that's the key thing. In this text, I hear my version, it says to increase. It's kind of hard to see, isn't it? But notice here it says le marbe. And this mem here is a closed mem, but it's at the beginning of a syllable. The first syllable is le, the second syllable is mar, and the third syllable is be. So this should be an open mem. It should not be closed, right? So again, you could say, oh, well, they just wrote it wrong. Mistake was happened, and people copied it on, from thereafter. No big deal. But no, there's significance to that. The second one, where it's open and should be closed, comes from Nehemiah. Nehemiah 2, he says, I went out by night through the valley gate to the dragon's well and the dung gate, and inspected the places where the walls of Jerusalem were broken down and where its gates had been burned down. In this case, it's broken down, where the walls were broken down is, it's really hard to read, isn't it? But you have here, ha matperutzim, broken down or opened up, right? And here you have ha, first syllable, ma is the next one, and then pit is the third one. This should be, it's because it's its own standalone syllable, that should be, I'm sorry, I'm saying this wrong. This is actually two words. It's not, they've been jammed together, and the one's been made part of it. So it's making this be part of this syllable, when really it's haim perutzim. They were broken down. But the haim just got slammed into the front of the perutzim and becomes just one word in the text. And it got repeated that way over and over again. So this is an open mem, but really it should be haim with the mem at the end of the word, and therefore it should be closed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Following that all right? Okay, so what do the rabbis say about this? So if you turn over your page, oops, did I not put this down here? Oh, I know. I couldn't find the reference for this. This was the one I couldn't find the text for, so I just have to explain it to you. Yeah. So what the Midrash says, but I had to include it because it's so much fun, even though I couldn't get the text for you. What the Midrash says is see, when the Messiah is not here yet, he's closed off. And so the mem is closed here because we're still waiting for the Isaiah passage to happen. We're still waiting for the Messiah to come. And so the mem is closed. That's the reason why it's closed. And the mem is open here because Jerusalem's walls have been broken down. Jerusalem, and by extension all of Israel, is weakened and subject to attack from its neighbors and oppression and all these sorts of things. So, when the Messiah is revealed, the Isaiah mem will be opened. And then he will close the mem in Nehemiah, because he will reestablish Israel and make it strong once again in the center of the world, where all the nations will come and worship the God of Israel along with Israel. that kind of cool?
Yes.
Again, do I buy it? Not necessarily, but it's just really clever and really fun. But it teaches something. There's something inspirational about it, and that sort of thing. I did one last Saturday that was actually rather moving. Very emotional. I was going to put it in here, but I guess I didn't. It's this. The Midrash says, why did God make Hosea marry a harlot? And the Midrash says, well, God went to Hosea and said, Hosea, I'm mad at Israel. I'm going to wipe them out. And Hosea said, go for it, buddy. Take them out. Quite the opposite of Moses saying, no, wipe me out in their stead, right? He just says, do it. And then God says to himself, what am I going to do with this old man? He's a callous bastard, He's just telling me, go ahead and do it. He says, I know. I'll have him marry a wanton woman. He'll have children with her, and then he'll see how hard it is. Because I'll ask him to send her away, and he won't be able to do it. And then he'll understand why I can't let Israel go. And then this happens. They have 3 children. They have 2 sons and a daughter. If you remember in the text, it says, one was named Lo Ami, not my people. The other one was No Ruchama, no mercy. And the other one was something else that's escaping me at the moment. And,
Just Ami, wasn't it?
No, there's Lo Ami. No, the first one was Yezreel. God will sow, because I'm going to sow my justice quickly on Israel. So they have these 3 children, and then God comes to Hosea and says, you got to send your wife away because she's been unfaithful with you. And he says, but King of the universe, it's my wife. I love her. He's gotten attached to this woman. And he goes, and these are my children. And God says, you don't even know if they're your children or not, because she's been unfaithful to you. And he says, but have compassion. I love them. I want to keep them. And then God says to him, see, this is why I can't just wipe Israel off the map, because I feel this way about Israel.
This is a profound truth in this.
Yes, isn't it?
It's
just expressing this deep, pathos that God has, this deep, incredible love for Israel that it's expressing. And, I think it's rather touching story, that Hosea kind of learns this way.
I think it reveals the heart of God in a very profound and
Yes,
accurate
exactly. Yeah, it's another really beautiful Midrash. I really like that. So we kind of went off the derrick there, but okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the New Testament. Now that you kind of got the idea, we see this Midrashic mindset in the authors of the New Testament. And you've got, in the case of Paul, certainly he was a Pharisee. He would have been very familiar with this. But even other ones, they show evidence of this, at least proto-Midrash. So the first one that I want to do is Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. I didn't give you the whole list. This is the very beginning of Matthew. And it starts with Abraham, and it lists all the generations down to David, and then David down to the exile, and the exile to Yeshua. But he concludes here, thus there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah. Now, a lot of people look at this list and they compare it to the list that's in Luke. And they say these lists don't match. And this is a problem, that they don't match. And the explanation you often get is that one was listing the genealogy of Joseph and the other one was listing the genealogy of Mary. Right? Sounds reasonable? And it's bunk. It was a midrash because Why the big deal about 14? What is such a big deal about 14? And the reason that it's a big deal is David here, has the numeric value of 14. This is what's called gematria. And we're getting proto-gematria here in Matthew. Matthew is not interested in preserving this perfect genealogical list of who begat whom. He's making a theological point that Yeshua is the descendant of David coming to reign as Messiah. And so you have this repetition of 14 to emphasize this point that he is indeed the son of David. He is the king of Judah who's coming to reign over Israel and the whole world. So he may even had a list of everybody and said, oh, I'll just leave that guy out to make 14. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, yeah, I would imagine that he actually did have some record of the genealogy.
There must have been something.
But he did remove part because, I mean, everybody knows that this is incomplete. Obviously, there's more than 14 generations.
Right, yeah. But when you look at it from this historical, grammatical point of view, it gives you fit. You know, how can this be wrong? How can this be, you know? But when you understand it from a Midrashic point of view, it's no big deal. It's not that this doesn't mean that it's mistaken or that it's not divinely inspired. Instead, no, it is divinely inspired. It's Matthew, you know, saying, I've encountered the Messiah, and how do I interpret that with the skills that I have, my understanding of the world and the text that I have. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now, another one that's even a clear example of this is just in the next chapter in Matthew 2:13. It says, after they had gone, an angel of Adonai appeared to Yosef in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you to leave. For Herod is going to look for the child in order to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and left during the night for Egypt, where he stayed until Herod died. This happened in order to fulfill what Adonai said about through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son, quoting our lovely Hosea here that's in love with his wife. So again, people get indigestion over this. If you go back and look at Hosea, it's clearly this son, reference there, it's the nation of Israel. So how can Matthew be saying this? This doesn't make any sense until you understand it midrashically. This is layers and layers of meaning that's hidden in the text. So we have the Peshat of Hosea. It's referring to the nation of Israel. But now we're finding the Drash, you know, that this is also referring to the Messiah. And this event in his life, Matthew is going back into the text with this knowledge of this event in Yeshua's life, and he's trying to find something that connects to that, and he finds this here.
Doesn't this also tie in with the understanding that the Messiah would be the true Son of God? I mean, in a certain sense, he is the perfect example of Israel. I mean, Israel was supposed to be God's son, but, you know, kind of fell short at times.
Right.
But now here, when the Messiah comes, he will not.
Right.
So it's not even, I mean, it's also an insight into.
No, you're bringing up a very important point. And I was going to say something before I keyed off of your thing. But since I can't think of it at the moment, yes, this is Messianic Jewish Midrash, if you will, as we talk about Yeshua as being the perfect one-man Israel. He embodies in his personhood all that Israel failed to be. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So you're exactly right. There's that concept. We think of him as the perfect one-man Israel. We also think of him as the living Torah, which we'll get to in a minute. He is the physical embodiment of Torah. And this reinforces the idea that he didn't do away with Torah. He's actually the living embodiment of Torah, what Torah meant was meant to be in its deepest level. So anyway, but this is the difference, I think, between Christian interpretation and Jewish interpretation that you brought up at the beginning, right? Christians would just say this is a type. Israel was a type, and it was clearly talking about Jesus and Hosea, and that's the way it is. Whereas Midrash says, no, it's both.
That's right.
Right? It's both, and maybe several more. This is actually a great irony of this. You get, what do you call people that defend their faith? Apologists, right? You get Jewish apologists who tackle Isaiah 53, and they really fight hard to show that this is the suffering servant is Israel. And then you have Christian apologists who grab that text and they say, no, this is very clearly talking about Jesus, and they clash with each other with all their proofs and all that and everything. When midrashically, it's both. There's no contention here. And the irony is that a lot of the Jewish apologists don't get that. They forget. And they, in their zeal to defend their beliefs or whatever it is, or they're just not knowledgeable about it. They're reacting emotionally, and they're forgetting that this is perfectly fine, that the suffering servant can be Israel and can be Yeshua. And again, that goes back to this one man Israel. He suffers, and there's actually many midrashim about Israel suffering on behalf of the world. And this was actually reinvigorated with the Holocaust. Some rabbis said, how do we make sense of this Holocaust? And they reached back into the tradition and found these references to Israel suffering on behalf of the world and brought that into the Holocaust. You had a question or a statement?
Well, I just had a realization that when you use the word irony, that rabbinic thinking, and especially Midrashic thinking, is also kind of ironic, in the sense that they can be very detail-oriented, like, these 5 vows and those 5 vows, but then they can also be all-encompassing and more general, in the sense of this passage means both things, or multiple reasons for Cain and Abel's conflict is all work.
And actually, I didn't mention this, but you're touching on a good point. Midrash is both atomistic, in that it will zero in on one letter, but then it's also very syncretistic, bringing these things together. It operates at both levels. Yes, it just goes at all these things from these two levels. Everything has significance. The little jot or tittle, and then the whole text as a whole also has significance. Okay, I think any other questions or anything there?
Well, there's some more.
We have some more text here. Yeah, so meanwhile, when Herod realized that the Magi had tricked him, he was furious and gave orders to kill all the boys in around Bethlehem, who were 2 years old or less, calculating from the time the Magi had told him. In this way were fulfilled the words spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and lamenting loudly. It was Rachel sobbing for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no longer alive. Jeremiah 31:15. Now, this is kind of interesting because Jeremiah, in a way, is almost like proto-midrash within the text itself, grabbing this thing about Rachel lamenting and weeping and then applying it to the situation in his day with the destruction of the temple. And then now we have Matthew taking it and saying, this is again, this Rachel weeping is again occurring over again with the slaughter of the innocents.
I really wonder when I think about this whole story, when Mary and Joseph returned with Jesus from Egypt, and they heard that this had occurred, if in their pious Judaism, they would not immediately have thought of this passage. I mean, just in their minds, they would say,
We don't know. We don't know how educated they were. We don't know how much they would have known. Clearly, Matthew was able to see this connection, whether they did or not. Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to come back to this Rama, Rachel weeping at the end. So, Yeshua himself did Midrash as a good proto-rabbi. He did this. In John 1, 43 through 51, it says, the next day, having decided to leave for the Galilee, Yeshua found Philip and said, follow me. Philip was from Bethsaida, the town where Andrew and Kepha lived. Kepha is Peter. And Philip found Nathanael and told him, we found the one that Moshe wrote about in the Torah and also the prophets. It's Yeshua ben Yosef from Nazareth. Nathanael answered him, Nazareth? What good can possibly come from there? Come and see, Philip said to him. Yeshua saw Nathanael coming toward him and remarked about him, here is a true son of Israel, nothing false in him. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Yeshua answered him, before Philip called you when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael said, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. He's convinced really fast, isn't he? Yeah. Yeshua answered him. I always picture Yeshua laughing when he says this. You believe all this just because I told you I saw you under a fig tree? You will see greater than that. And then he said to him, yes, indeed, I will tell you that you will see heaven opened and the angels of God going up and coming down on the Son of Man. Does that sound familiar?
Jacob's ladder.
Jacob's ladder, right? So, I really believe that Yeshua is building off of some proto-midrash about Jacob's ladder. And there's tons of midrash about Jacob's ladder. The rabbis are just absorbed with this mysterious vision that he has of the ladder, and there's all kinds. So I'm giving you two here because they're significant. The first one is from, both of these are from Midrash Rabbah. Bar Kapara taught, no dream is without its interpretation. And behold, a ladder symbolizes the stairway leading to the top of the altar in the temple. Set up on the earth is the altar. As it said, an altar of earth thou shalt make unto me. In Exodus 20. And the top of it reached to heaven, the sacrifices, the scent of which ascended to heaven. And behold, the angels of God, the high priest, ascending and descending on it is them ascending and descending the stairway to make the sacrifices. And behold, the Lord stood beside him. And then he quotes Amos 9, I saw the Lord standing beside the altar. So Bar Kapara is saying that this vision of the ladder is a vision of the temple, right? And the ladder is the stairway up to make the sacrifices at the altar. The angels are the priests who are coming up and down in order to perform their duties. And he has this stone. Jacob has this stone that he sleeps on, as a pillow. Actually, that was one I meant to give you guys, and I forgot to put it in here. Anyway, and so what's Yeshua doing here? Yeshua could be alluding to this and speaking of himself that he's going to be the sacrifice. Mm-hmm. That he's going to be the one who both serves as high priest and also offers himself up as a sacrifice when he alludes to this mysterious allusion that he's making. Right? The second one, the rabbis related it to Sinai. Now, whenever in the Talmud it says the rabbis, and they don't name the person, this is usually, it means this was the generally accepted opinion. And so...
had its origin more in oral history?
Pardon me? Well, they both would be from oral history, but they've preserved who gave it's like a minority opinion with the Supreme Court. So Bar Kapara is the minority opinion here, and then the consensus was this interpretation. They related his vision to Sinai, and he dreamed to behold a ladder, symbolizes Sinai, set up on the earth. As it says, they stood at the foot of the mountain, and the top of it reached heaven, and the mountain burned with fire unto the heart of heaven, in Deuteronomy 4. And behold, the angels of God alludes to Moses and Aaron. Ascending as Moses went up to God, and descending Moses went down from the mount. They're quoting these passages. And behold, the Lord stood beside him, and then they quote, and the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai. So here, it's not the temple, but it's Mount Sinai. So if Yeshua is thinking of this, or maybe both, he could be referring to himself as the living Torah. You know, the one who is this new Sinai, this renewed Sinai, where he's coming to give the deepest meaning of the Torah. That could be what's happening here with Yeshua's teaching, but you know, a lot of people puzzle over what's he talking about Jacob's dream for, and when you look at it midrashically, you say maybe this could possibly be the case, that that's what Yeshua was doing.
So, Yeshua was interpreting Jacob's dream.
Yeah, he was doing Midrash. Exactly. Now, I forgot to put this in here, but I'll just quickly mention this. When Peter says or when Yeshua says to Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, there's a whole set of midrashim about Jacob's ladder again, this vision, and with that rock that he used as a pillow. And one midrash has it that after he got up, God dipped his toe down from heaven and drove this rock into the ground, and it's underneath the Temple Mount. And that when he says it's upon this rock I will build my church, it could be again a reference to this, midrash that God built this. Again, he's the temple. His body is the temple, and he talks about tear the temple down, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. It's a very distinct possibility.
I figured that when Yeshua does a midrash, he gets it in. That just spot on.
Yeah.
It's like,
Or maybe he recognizes that there are multiple ones and he's just doing a really bang-up job with one of them. Could be. Okay. I don't know where I'm at on slides. Okay, yeah, we're to that one. Okay, so the next one is Paul does Midrash. As a good rabbi, good Pharisee, of course he does this. In Galatians 3, he says, now the promises were made to Abraham and to his seed. It doesn't say, and to seeds, as if to many. On the contrary, it speaks of one, and to your seed, and this one is the Messiah.
classic.
This is classic, and if you go back and look at the text he's referring to, the word seed in Hebrew is in the singular.
It's a collective sin.
But it's very clearly talking about the descendants of Abraham. It's not talking about one person. So again, people get angst driven about it and say, how can Paul be doing this to this? He's doing violence to the text. No, Paul's playing off of the fact that Zerah, the seed in Hebrew, is singular, even though it's clearly meant to be plural. The Peshat it's plural, even though it's in the singular. But then he's using it to say, but the hidden meaning here is it's pointing to one particular seed, and that's the Messiah.
Now see, in English, seed can be a collective.
Right. In Hebrew it can't, but it does sometimes get used that way.
So that's significant, because
Yeah.
I never really got this because I'm looking at it in English.
Right.
I just said
Seed,
it's a
I said,
collective
well, okay, his seed,
Yeah.
obviously it was a collective, it was a
Yeah.
plural
But if you
noun.
go back to the text, look at the
But
Hebrew.
in Hebrew,
it's singular.
There isn't that option.
Huh?
It's, so in Hebrew,
No, there's Zerah, which means seed, and then there's Zeraim, which means seeds. Did I get that right, Anna?
So why does
And-
it say Zerayim?
Huh?
Why didn't it say Zerayim?
Good question. Right?
Well, there's also like.
But that's what Paul's doing. He's doing just what the other
I was telling you.
Midrash, yeah. He's doing exactly what the other Midrashists are doing, and he's saying this is not just an accident or this is not just a scribal error or something. There's significance to this. So we have the Peshat that it was referring to the descendants, but now I'm giving you this drash of how it was also talking about the Messiah. Yes?
To respond more on like a basic level, right, Hebrew, in the ancient world, Hebrew wasn't standardized. And you see even different uses of words having different nuances of meaning developing over time.
Yeah. Just like any language does.
And later, earlier texts. And so it could have been possible that like, even whoever was like writing that down, like either didn't realize that C's grammatically should be in the plural, or that that wasn't a specification. And like, people just weren't that grammatically correct back then.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay, 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, for brothers, I do not want you to miss the significance of what happened to our fathers. Let me introduce this for you. Here, Paul is going to do Midrash on Midrash. This is really cool. Okay, he's doing it up good. I love Midrash. Agadic Midrash. Halakhic Midrash, yeah, I can take it or leave it, but Agadic Midrash I love. For brothers, I don't want you to miss the significance of what happened to our fathers. All of them were guided by the pillar of cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And in connection with the cloud and with the sea, they were all immersed themselves into Moshe. So he's making this allusion to baptism here. Also, they all ate the same food from the Spirit, the manna, and they all drank the same drink from the Spirit, the water. For they drank from a Spirit-sent rock which followed them. And that rock was the Messiah. Yet, with the majority of them, God was not pleased, so their bodies were strewn across the desert. So what the heck? A rock was following them? What's he doing here? This is really bizarre. Until you understand that there's actually a midrash about this rock following them. Because if you remember at the beginning of the Exodus, he hits the rock and water comes out. And then at the end, he's told to speak to it. Halfway across the desert, he's told to speak to it, but in anger, he strikes it. And this midrash says it's the same rock. It actually rolled around and followed them in the desert. So here it is. It's from the Tosefta. Now, the Tosefta is stuff that didn't make it into the Mishnah. If you remember from Hannah's lecture, the Talmud is made up of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Tosefta is additional things. I think it actually means additional, doesn't it? Yeah. It's additional things that just they decided for whatever reason not to put it in the Mishnah, but it's still preserved and gets referenced to. So in the Tosefta, it says, so the well, which was with Israel in the wilderness, was like a rock of the size of a large round vessel, and was oozing out and rising as the mouth of this flask, traveling with them up the mountains and going down with them to the valleys. Wherever Israel camped, it encamped opposite them before the door of the tabernacle. So this is, now again, the Tosefta is written later as other Midrashim were written, but clearly this must have been an existing thing that Paul is building off of here and referencing it. And now he's doing Midrash on the Midrash and saying that rock that actually followed him around the desert was Yeshua. This was like the pre-incarnate Yeshua giving them water. Now he's giving spiritual water, living water to us.
And you're right, we do talk about this in Christian theology. We talk about this as type and antitype.
Right.
I mean, which it really amounts to very much the same thing.
Very similar.
It's not quite as flexible as the
Exactly.
Midrash concept is a little more flexible.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a key difference. And they may not, do the same kind of things, like take field from Genesis and field from Micah and join it together like that. It usually has to be a little more obvious to pull the two together. But yes, it's similar. Okay. Peter refers to Midrash. I don't think he's actually doing Midrash here, but at least he's referring to it. In 2 Peter, he says, and he did not spare the ancient world. On the contrary, he preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, and brought the flood upon a world of ungodly people. A herald of righteousness. Sometimes it's translated preacher of righteousness. But if you go back to the text, there's nothing in the text about Noah trying to persuade people to repent. There's nothing about Noah preaching to anybody or telling them, the end is nigh.
It's not there.
It's not there. But we have a Midrash, and it's preserved in the Talmud. It says, Rabbi Yosi of Caesarea taught, what is meant by the verse, he is swift as the waters, their portion is cursed in the earth. He beholds not the way of the vineyards. This is a verse out of Job. This teaches that the righteous Noah rebuked them, urging, repent, for if not, the Holy One, blessed be he, will bring a deluge upon you and cause your bodies to float upon the water like gourds.
Like gourds. How descriptive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so again, Peter is probably referencing this Midrash and referring to Noah as this preacher of righteousness, even though the text says nothing about Noah being a preacher. Okay, so that's just a few examples of Midrash, both by the rabbis and then what we see Midrash in the New Testament. There's many others, but we could go on for hours looking at all the different ones that are in there. But I wanted to end with the really fun stuff, and that is Messianic Midrash. So I've begun writing Midrash. And what I've been doing, this has been going on for maybe a couple of years now, is I'll take an existing Midrash, but then connect it into the New Testament somehow and bring something out. And this is one of my favorites, God's Kiss. Song of Songs Rabbah asks, so Song of Songs Rabbah, this is a Midrash on the Song of Songs. It asks, may he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. This is from the very beginning of the Song of Songs. And this is that, it's the lover and the beloved, right? Where was this song recited, is asked. Now they give a whole bunch of answers. I'm just giving you one here. Our sages said that it was recited at Sinai when Israel received the Torah. So again, remember, our sages said this means it was the predominant opinion. But if you look at the full text, it'll give you a few others that other guys said. But this is the predominant opinion, that this kiss happened at Sinai. The word itself would go and turn to each and every Israelite at Sinai and say to them, do you receive me upon yourself? Such and such commandments are there in me, such and such judgments as there are in me, such and such punishments as they are in me, such and such decrees as they are in me, such and such as easy or difficult in me, such and such a reward that is in me. And they would say yes and yes. And immediately the word would kiss them on their mouths and teach them Torah. So that's the Midrash from Song of Songs Rabbah. A very beautiful image of the Holy Spirit kissing and sealing this covenant at Sinai with this tender kiss. And what they're building off of here is that the Song of Songs itself was viewed as this story of God and Israel. Just as oftentimes in the church, it's God and the church. It's, by the rabbis, it's viewed as this love story between God and Israel. And so it's building off of that kind of thing. But Rav Itzhak said, that's me. But it says kisses. It's plural. Where was the song recited a second time? At Golgotha. For it says, Yeshua cried out with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. The word itself would go and turn to each and every Jew and say to them, do you receive me, the full revelation of Torah? Do you receive this new covenant that writes the Torah on your hearts? And if they said yes, immediately the word would kiss them on the mouth and imbue them with the living Torah. Turn it over. Likewise, the nations of the world were there. The word itself would go and turn to each and every one of them and say, do you receive me, the full realization of Torah? Do you receive this covenant which binds you to me and to my people? And if they said yes, immediately the word would kiss them on their mouth and imbue them with the living Torah. So when I saw the kisses, I said, wait a minute, they only talked about one kiss. But as a Messianic Jew, I can see where the other kiss occurred. And it's at these two mountains, Sinai and Golgotha, where this is happening. Now, notice that it refers to the word would go around kissing them, right? This is, we don't have time to go into all this, but this was viewed as we have in John, in the beginning was the Word. We talked about that passage before, that this was the pre-incarnate Yeshua at Sinai kissing them on the lips and sealing this covenant with Israel. And then now we have him doing it again at Golgotha.
This Midrash, the first part of the Midrash, when they said the word goes around, you've got to capitalize everything here.
Yes.
Can't be an accident. Now, if it's capitalized in there, no, I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. Yes, in Aramaic, the word is memra. In Hebrew, it's devar. And it was very clearly taken as being some form of God that was separate from God, but yet same with God. We could do a whole night on this if we haven't already. We already done this topic?
Let's do that.
We'll do that one.
Do that sometime.
It's really, really interesting to look at this. I've been saving it for the parting of the ways, because what we look at here is that in the early, first few centuries, Judaism did have this pluralistic, at least a what's the word? There's Benites, Benitarian. Yeah, Benitarian. There was at least many Jews in the first century that had a Benitarian view because of texts that are in the Old Testament, which we'll look at. But then what happened was as the church separated from Israel, they kind of drove theology into each other's arms and said, we can't have this anymore, it's too much like the Trinity. And then the Christians said, we can't have this anymore, it's too much like Judaism. And they sort of like agreed on who gets what. It sort of gets divvied up.
Like it came in.
Yeah, exactly. There you go again. So now, one of my intentions for writing the Midrash this way as well is that, notice, this reinforces the idea that this is not something new that God's doing. He's bringing the fullest realization of Torah and sacrifice on the behalf of the nations of the world and Israel. It's not like this radically new something else has been done. And notice my wording is very choice here, where it says, do you receive this covenant that binds you to me and to my people? So again, where I'm emphasizing this notion that it's not that God created this new spiritual Israel, but it's actually those of the nations of the world who are accepting him are being grafted into Israel. So I'm picking very particular language here. Okay, another one. I know we're getting on there. Yeshua's weeping. Jacob foresaw, this is a midrash from Genesis Rabbah. Jacob foresaw that the exiles were destined to pass through there. That it's talking about the burial of Rachel. She's buried on the way back to the land. So Jacob foresaw that the exiles were destined to pass through there in the future as they were being sent into exile by the Babylonians. And so for that reason, he buried Rachel there so that she could plead for mercy on their behalf. So this is a midrash attempting to explain, why didn't he take Rachel to Machpelah and bury her with the rest of the family? He just leaves her by the side of the road, outside the land, or if not outside, of just immediately over into the land. I don't remember which, right? And it's attempting to deal with that. And they say, there's a reason for it. As people are being taken to Babylon in exile, Rachel will be there weeping for her children. This is the connection back to Hosea, pleading on the behalf of Israel. Rav Itzhak said, that's me, likewise, Yeshua was buried outside the walls of Jerusalem, so that as it was being destroyed and the exiles would walk past, he would plead for mercy on their behalf, but it was from an empty tomb. So Rachel's in her tomb, but Yeshua's tomb is empty, and he's in heaven praying and pleading for the exiles. Okay, you want to do the last one? real quick?
Yes.
Okay.
I do.
All right, God's anger. This is a really fun one. I did this last year in a sermon. This is the Midrash taken out of the Talmud. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, wait till my countenance of wrath shall have passed away, and then I will give you rest. This is in Exodus 33 when God's really angry. But is anger then a mood of the Holy One, blessed be he? The Talmud asks. Yes, is the answer. For it has been taught, God that has indignation every day, quoting Psalm 7:12. And how long does this indignation last? 1 moment, 1 split second, 1 instant. How long is 1 moment? 1/58,888th part of an hour is the definition given for a moment, an instant. And no creature has ever been able to fix that precisely this moment except for the wicked Balaam, of whom it is written, he knows the knowledge of the Most High. Numbers 24:16. So what's going on here? So it's looking at this and it's taking the text very literally, because we have God being angry and he tells Moses, hang on a second, it'll pass. Right? I won't be angry anymore. I'll be merciful again. So he's got like this moment where he's going to bring judgment on Israel. Hang on a second, it'll pass, then we can talk. Right? That's what they're dealing with here. And then it says, but this only happens once a day. And it quotes that the fact that it's in the singular here in Psalm 7, that God is indignant every day. So he's indignant for just a moment every day. But when's this moment? Who knows? And they say, but Balaam knew, that's why he was hired to curse Israel. He was going to come, he knew the exact moment when God would be angry and he would put the curse on Israel, and God would have to curse Israel because he was in that moment of anger and judgment. That's what's happening here. Makes sense? And then it quotes him, if you go to Numbers 24, it talks about Balaam comes before the king and he's talking about himself, and then it says he knows the knowledge of the Most High. So they're interpreting this as he knows that instant of when it's going to happen. Rav Itzhak said, that's me, Yeshua is the true Baal Regah. Regah is this Hebrew word for instant or moment. And Baal is master of the moment. Right? So Balaam was the master of the moment. He knew when he could curse Israel. But no, Rav Itzhak says, Yeshua is the true Baal Regah. As it says, I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I will have compassion on you, Isaiah 54. And in a Regah, he will redeem Israel and the nations. As it says, it will happen in a moment, in the blink of an eye, when the last trump is blown. So here I'm tying together a few different things, right? Isaiah 54, if you go back there, God's talking about being angry for a moment on whom? Israel, right? And Yeshua is the one man Israel. God is angry at him for that split second that he dies on the cross, right? God brings the judgment. When it refers to anger here, it's really more talking about judgment than him just being upset. And so Yeshua knew the exact moment to die and to take that judgment and keep it from the world. And then, of course, Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about that the Messiah will return in a split instant in a Regah. So Yeshua is the true Baal Regah, not Balaam. It's Yeshua who is doing that. that kind of fun?
Yes, it is.
I really have enjoyed writing these and hope to continue to write them.
So, will they have, where will be published?
I would like to eventually publish a book. Yes, because I think that this is something that's not happened in our movement that I'm aware of. We have some very top-notch theologians who deal with the text really, really well. And, Mark is obviously a top dog in that area. But I've not seen much of this engagement with the text in this Midrashic way, which is such a Jewish way of approaching the text. And, so I'd like to actually publish these at some point, God willing, so that, it might spur other people in our movement to, catch the vision of doing it.
It would be interesting to see what a current Midrash rabbi would do with it. I mean, who's not.
Those exist.
Yes.
Yes, there's been a renewal of interest in Midrash in the last 20 years or so. And I have a book at home that's called Midrash and Art. And it's written by a Jewish woman who's an art therapist. And she'll take like a text from scripture, but then she'll use it with somebody in the context of art therapy, and then it becomes like this art midrash. There are people today who write modern midrashim. They're obviously not connecting it to the New Testament, but they're doing it again.
There are Jewish feminists who, in response to being saddened by emptiness of women in history, including scripture, that write feminist midrash where they try to fill in the gaps of missing women.
Yeah. Well, that as well.
So, you got me to the questions.
Sure, we can take a few minutes.
You said that Midrash, they're thinking in terms of what was God thinking,
Mm-hmm.
not so much what was the writer thinking. So then, but I wouldn't instinctively anyway give Midrash the same weight of authority as the scripture itself. But if they're telling you what they think God was thinking, that sounds like it ought to be really authoritative. So what is the authority of Midrash if you have that mindset?
Yeah, very good question. In the early days when Midrash was being written, the rabbis would have said, this is divine inspiration. This is, we're seeing these connections in there. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, where you have rabbis who are more trained in the Socratic type of approach, so they're more influenced by Western philosophy and, how you gotta do everything by the book and it's very organized and everything. You see them sort of condemning Midrash to a certain point and saying, we need to really stick to the Peshat. And so they diminish the Midrash because of that.
Did you define the term Peshat?
Yeah, I did earlier, the simple meaning. Rashi is one of them. Rashi is a French rabbi who lived around the year 1000 AD. And he's like the Thomas Aquinas of the Jewish world. Hannah showed in her lecture how the Talmud always has Rashi commentary on it. You get Rashi commentary in your Bibles. He was of this notion that, Midrash really is a secondary and we shouldn't put too much weight to this. On the other hand, he wrote Midrash. Actually, he is the one, if you go back, I don't think I pointed this out, but if you go back to the missing Vavs, the very second one, this is actually a Midrash written by Rashi. So even though he sort of condemned it, he also engaged in it as well.
It's interesting that a name like Rashi.
Well, it's not really his name. Yeah, it's not really his name. A lot of the famous rabbis were given acronyms. And so like the Rambam is another very famous rabbi from the 1200s. And his name is Rabbi Rambam. Moshe ben Maimonides, right? Maimonides, yeah. Maimonides, yeah, I can't say it right. Like I said, my brain's fried today.
That's interesting that he was more minimalistic, because this strikes me as being one of the more fanciful Midrash on the page. So.
Yeah, you know, can contradict ourselves at times.
So I have another question. Did that Midrashic mindset contribute to confidence in the text, in the faithfulness of the text over long, long periods of time? Like, Midrashic mindset being that every single jot tittle is meaningful, and you don't correct something that
Right.
anywhere. So, did that contribute to confidence in the accuracy of the text, or did it contribute to the actual accuracy of the text over time?
You mean like somebody might have edited it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very possible that happened, and that it did. That a notion would have become so prevalent that it would have been just sort of edited in. A good example of this is that remember I was talking about this rock with Jacob and ladder and all that. There's quite a few midrashim that talk about Abraham being this sort of chip off the old block, and God's the block, he's the rock. And in the Septuagint, there are places where in the Hebrew it says tzur, rock, and it gets translated in Greek as theos, God. They've completely subliminated this notion that rock means God, and it just got translated as God. And so you see a case there where, you know, this understanding actually came out in the translation. Does that answer your question or no? But I think to answer your original question maybe is that, you know, like I said, I think this reinforced the idea of inerrancy of Scripture and the sacredness of Scripture by saying these are just layers of meaning that God intended, you know, and I'm discovering them, I'm rooting them out, I'm seeking them out. Hannah, you had a question or comment?
Oh yeah, I was going to also add something to your answer to your first question about authority. I kind of view it kind of like the level of authority, because you kind of see how like theology gets worked out in the Midrash, and so it's like a similar level of authority that would be given to that people would give to specific theologians today. Even traditionally, right? Like Calvinists like the way Calvin, I don't know much about theology, like interpreted scripture, like as a kind of salvation or whatever they're determining.
Eternal security believer.
Yeah, and so, like I think maybe it's a little bit more authority than that, but it's...
Yeah, because these guys weren't just teachers that can be wrong. They were finding out what God was thinking when they wrote it.
People would say that these theologians are doing the same thing.
Yeah, some people could, yeah.
Look at it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, this guy got it right, the other guy got it wrong.
Exactly.
When I hear you explain this, as you're going through this, it strikes me that the effect of this would be to enrich and deepen Jewish culture and Jewish heritage so that in the time of this dispersion, which has been so long, the essential Judaism and the Jewish people were preserved.
Exactly.
It seems to me like it's very precious to the central culture and essence of Judaism in the world today as we are now. I mean, without a nation, a temple, and the sacrifices and all.
Yeah. A little bit different, but there's a saying, the Jews did not keep the Sabbath kept the Jews. And it was, you know, the practice of halacha that preserved the people. But you're right, it's also this cultural agata that also fed the people and comforted them. And, you know, to be driven out of Poland or something, or to have your house burned down, and then to think of, I'm suffering on the behalf of the world as a Jew, is comforting in the midst of the suffering and pain. And so it, helps you. And this is actually why the Baal Shem Tov was so popular. He's the founder of Hasidic Judaism in the 1700s, where, by that time, Judaism had gotten very rarefied. And if you weren't at a yeshiva being this rabbi who can memorize 500 volumes of Talmud, you were kind of nobody. And what the Baal Shem Tov did is he brought it all down to the masses. And he used this kind of material. And people ate it up. They were like, this is something that can feed my soul, even if I can't sit in the study hall 8 hours a day like the other guys. I'm Tevye the milkman. I can't do that, but I can be encouraged by these things.
And so that comes back to your answer. You said, well, at the time this was being written, people did say we were being inspired by God. Yes, I think they were, because God is looking over Israel to preserve it, and this is the way in which He preserved him. He was inspired by God in a very rich way.
Well, I think it's also.
We haven't read them all, though. You may not be inspired.
I think it's also, though, I think that the West tends to be very suspicious of the imagination, and that the imagination is part of our fallen nature, whereas the East tends to see imagination as something that's positive and good and can be inspired by the Spirit in this way. Yes, sir.
When you were reading the one about God's kiss, I was thinking, I've been reading a little bit of some of the things out from Hannah's class about the Talmud and stuff like that. And there's a reference in there many times to something they call, excuse me if I pronounce it wrong, S-H-E-K.
Shekinah.
Shekinah.
Yeah, Shekinah.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what this, because they talk about this as being, I don't want to say a separate entity.
Yeah. Well, this is part
I
of
don't want to
the.
say this, I don't
Yeah.
want, because then you're making it's actually physically to God.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that, but it almost has a different persona, almost like a feminine persona.
Mhm.
It's-
Yeah, I think it's like
It describes that in some other things,
Right.
but is that kind of
Yeah.
what this?
Shekinah is that aspect of God that dwells with Israel. It's not God that's in the temple above the mercy seat. It's the Shekinah. Now, what does that mean? Ontologically, they never really, again, the West focuses in on ontology and says, we got to define this stuff. What does this mean? In the East, there's less of an angst about that, and so it's just not really dealt with until you get the formation of Christianity, heavily influenced by Western thought, that you end up getting this kind of ripped apart, and then the rabbis say, we can't have this anymore because it's too much like
Was it
the
seen
Trinity.
as a separate entity though?
Well, again, that's the thing, is it's the way I like to think of it, if being a chemist, electrons aren't really particles flying around the center of an atom. It's actually a probability distribution, right? And where what you call a particle going around is really just the densest probability that it exists there at any one moment in time. I'm probably really getting technical here. But you think of, if you remember back to high school chemistry, they talked about electron clouds. And the reason for that is that electrons really, they're like particles, but they're also like waves. It's really confusing when you get to the quantum level. It's something totally different. And so really, when we say this electron is in this orbital, we're just saying most of the time it's in that orbital. That's kind of how I think of the Shekinah. It's kind of like this spot of density of God. But that doesn't mean that God's not everywhere else. And so, but that's how it was viewed. It was viewed as, and the Shekinah is the part of God that suffers with Israel, that it weeps, it mourns. There's actually a beautiful Midrash, another one, that talks about why did God choose a thorn bush to speak to Moses with the flaming bush. And it says it's because God was expressing his suffering with Israel in their slavery. And now you could do a Messianic Midrash on that with the crown of thorns. You know, you could. I haven't done that one yet, but I've certainly thought about it. You know, again, but they talk about that as being the Shekinah in that thorn bush, not just God. But it's this aspect of God that dwells with Israel. And by the way, it's the part that leaves Israel when they're thrown out of the land. You know, God says, you've sinned so much, I can't be with you anymore. And he leaves the temple, and the temple's destroyed. And so, yes.
Can Midrash shed light on some passages that have confused me? For instance, in John, there is this, somebody accuses, the Pharisees or somebody accused Jesus of making himself one with God, and he talks about, and he quotes a psalm about where God said, you are gods. Or
Yes, this is a Midrashic response. We could have looked at that.
I have looked at that psalm, and I can't make head or tail out of it. So is there a Midrash that can shed light on what the heck Jesus meant when he said
I
he was pulling out of that?
Yeah, I don't know if there's one that already existed or if this was a new one he was coming up with. I don't know which. But I'm pretty sure that in that psalm, it uses the word Elohim, which normally means gods, but sometimes it's used, to Hannah's point, it gets used for judges. It sometimes gets used for like leaders of tribes. It gets used for the angels sometimes.
Yeah,
And I think in that particular passage, it actually means children, believe it or not. It's talking about I believe so. I may be wrong on this. We have to go back and look. I'll go back and look at it. But I think, because isn't he playing off of the fact that it's sons? But then he says, I think it is. So we'd have to go back and look. But I think he is building off of this sense that Elohim can mean God, but it also can mean these other things. And then he's using that to defend them, or defend his position.
Which is really a very soft defense, considering what we think of him now. God from God, light from light, true God.
Yeah.
Begotten, I made one of you with the Father, through him all things were made. That's not quite, he's not quite making that claim. He just said, well, the linguistic.
Well, again, seeing that Western philosophy, there were splits in the early church over what exactly is the ontology of God. Whereas in the East, is not as much of a concern on that. It's more what is God doing in the world than what is God like. Now, you do get it in medieval Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. But again, that's after the rabbis have been heavily immersed into this, to Western philosophy, that they begin to then talk about, how can the Shekinah be, God and not God, and these sorts of things.
I just have one more comment on the Shekinah, which is, I just wanted to affirm that what you said about the Shekinah being feminine. It is viewed that way, as like the feminine part of God. And it's something in the current day, especially when you get more into like mysticism and you talk about the different attributes of God. They talk about masculine attributes and feminine attributes. And then egalitarian Jews in modern times have really embraced this idea that God isn't just masculine, but he's also, he's above, he transcends gender.
Which you actually see in the text. God, more often than not, refers to himself in a masculine way in the text. But then there are texts in the Old Testament where he says, there's one of the prophets says, I long to nurse Israel at my breast. He's using a very motherly image there. you know, and Yeshua does that. You know, how I've longed to pull you under my wings. You know, this is a mother hen would do her chicks. You know, this is a very motherly view of God. So you do have both of these images. It's just more weighted to the masculine side.
Okay, well, I found it. Is it okay to it's just like a couple of verses.
Go ahead.
We're not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you of your man claim to be God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world?
Yeah, so if you go back and look at that psalm he's
So what
quoting,
psalm does it refer to then?
yeah, I think you'll see that
6.
it's referring to the sons of Israel, I believe. So again, he's playing on the Peshat and the Drash here with the text.
82:6.
I said you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High.
Yeah, there you go.
Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes.
Yeah, so in that case, they're translating that gods, but it may have also meant like you are princes or you're, you know, part of the chosen people. And then it says you're sons of the Most High. I don't think that's saying that Jews are part of God, you know, or the Son of God.
Oh, it begins,
But-
God
but-
resides in the great assembly, he gives judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked?
Yeah, which is a whole other thing. You know, how does he do that if there are no gods but him? It's probably talking about these heavenly powers that we see in several of the visions of the throne room. That's Elohim. Angels get referred to as Elohim as well as God. And so Yeshua's definitely playing off of that in his response. He's giving a midrashic response to their assault. Okay, we could stay and ask questions, but I know I kept you long. Thanks.